Okay, Matthew 20, verse 17. And Jesus, going up to Jerusalem, took the 12 disciples apart in the way and said unto them, Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be betrayed unto the chief priests and unto the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles to mock, to scourge, and to crucify him. But on the third day he shall rise again. We noted back in chapter 19 that Jesus had begun his journey toward Jerusalem for the purpose of the cross. But he has obviously had some interruptions along the way. The Pharisees testing him in relation to marriage and divorce was one interruption. Of course, there was the scene of families bringing their children to Jesus so that he would pray over them. The disciples certainly, in their estimation, saw this as an interruption. And then there are his interactions with the rich young ruler that we looked at this morning. And so now we see he and his disciples getting back on the road again, as it were. And he is on the road to the cross. He is headed to Jerusalem for his final days on this earth. The phrase in verse number 18 says, we go up to Jerusalem. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it struck me ironic this week because tomorrow morning, 26 of us here from Laurel, along with others from various points around the country, will be boarding a flight and literally going up to Jerusalem. So I just had to stop here and zero in on these verses since it tied in perfectly to what we are headed to Jerusalem to experience ourselves. Of course, what the Lord is doing in real time here in Matthew 19 or Matthew 20 is giving us a third and final prediction of his impending death, burial, and resurrection. He's saying to his 12 disciples, behold, or look, pay attention to what I'm telling you. We are going to Jerusalem. And I know I've said this before, but you need to understand that there in Jerusalem, I will die and I will rise again. And what a great opportunity that we have also to go over to Jerusalem to experience the places where Christ fulfilled this very prediction in Matthew chapter 20. Now we understand that what Jesus says in this time frame will happen in Jerusalem, and it was always part of his divine sovereign plan for the redeeming of his people's sin. He was going to Jerusalem where he would not experience a surprise attack upon his life. That's not how this is going to go down. This is not a leisure trip. Of course, they're also going to identify the season of Passover. So they're not going down to Passover and then, oh, by the way, while the Lord's there, surprise attack on his life. They arrest him, they mock him, they scourge him, they crucify him. They never saw this coming. That's not it at all. In fact, he not only knows precisely every intricate detail of what's going to happen there, we need to constantly remind ourselves that he orchestrated it all after the counsel of his own will. Of course, the disciples knew that going to Jerusalem was a part of the Passover celebration, but they did not know that Jesus Christ himself was the Passover lamb. Now, he had mentioned this to them in their dealings with the Lord and his teaching to them over and over again, but they weren't thinking about this. They still saw Jesus as a lion, but not as a lamb. They were thinking about the kingdom. They weren't thinking about sacrifice. They were thinking about glory. They weren't thinking about suffering. So when Jesus says in these verses here in Matthew 20, behold, or look up here, pay attention to me. We are going to Jerusalem, and you need to know this is what's going to happen when we get there. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to stand in unfair trial. I will be scourged. I will be mocked. I will be put to death. And even in the midst of all that, it's still like they didn't hear the last part. But I will rise again. Jesus was going to Jerusalem because that is where he was to sacrifice himself for the sin of the world. And we go to Jerusalem tomorrow to see the places where these historical scenes were carried out. And as I mentioned this briefly before the service, I do hope in the years to come that many of you will join us for this great spiritual endeavor. With that in mind, I'd like for us to look at this passage as we consider the thought we go to Jerusalem. Number one, we go to Jerusalem where, first of all, he was betrayed. We go to Jerusalem where he was betrayed. That's exactly what he said is going to happen in verse 18, right? He said, behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be betrayed. He will be betrayed unto, specifically here, the chief priest and the scribes. Now, we know what the Lord is predicting here. The Lord is predicting this scene whereby one of his own, one of the 12, Judas, would come and betray the Lord. In fact, leave your Bible marker there in Matthew chapter 20, and I want you to flip forward just a few chapters to Matthew chapter 26. I want us to go back and forth with each of these 7 points and see the corresponding principle that is being carried out for us with each one of these predictions that the Lord makes. And so that's where he begins. We're going to Jerusalem, and there the Son of Man will be betrayed. And then when we get there, we see how it all unfolds. Matthew 26, look at verse 14. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went unto the chief priest and said unto them, what will ye give me? And I will deliver him unto you. We'll come back to this when we return, but it's quite interesting because wasn't it Peter at the end of the message this morning in Matthew chapter 19 who said, hey, Lord, we've forsaken all to follow you. What will you give us for doing that? It's quite the wrong perspective. It's why he ends the chapter by saying the first will be last and the last will be first, and then we're going to go right into the scene here in chapter 20. But it seems like Judas has not shaken that off yet. Because here we fast forward to the night of his betrayal, and he's still saying the same thing. I've spent the last 3 years with this man. I've left everything. I have forsaken all and followed him. And nothing good, in my opinion, has come from it. That's what Judas is thinking. He didn't get what he wanted by following Jesus. And so he decides to go to the chief priests and the scribes and see maybe what they would give him, since Jesus didn't give him what he wanted. And so Judas comes and says, what will ye give me, and I will deliver him unto you. And of course they agreed, they covenanted together, they formed a contract for 30 pieces of silver. And from that time, Judas sought an opportunity to betray him. Skip down to verse 47. This is the scene. And while he yet spake, lo, Judas, one of the 12, came, and with him a great multitude with swords and staves for the chief priest and elders of the people. You know the scene here. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's praying. And Kate said this week, Daddy, I want to go to Israel with you sometime. And I said, you will, but you're going to have to be older before we take you. And she said, I want to go because I want to see the Garden of Eden. That's what I want to see. I'll explain it to her later, but there is one garden that is significant, the Garden of Gethsemane. In fact, I'll show you a picture here. This is a picture of our trip that we last went on, the beautiful olive presses of the Garden of Gethsemane. This week, we will have a worship service while praying and spending time around God's Word. This is where it all unfolded. Jesus is praying with his disciples. Judas goes and he has this contract. And so here they usher in him and the chief priest. And the deal is, look at it, verse 48 of Matthew 26. Now he that betrayed him gave them a sign, saying, whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he. Hold him fast. And forthwith he came to Jesus and said, Hail, Master. What audacity. The plan all along. And Jesus knew it was going to happen, yielded himself to it. And Judas, it seems like at this point, with no shame whatsoever, still calls him Master and kissed him. We go to Jerusalem because Jesus said, it's in Jerusalem that I will be betrayed. Secondly, we go to Jerusalem where not only he was betrayed, but where he was condemned. Go back to chapter 20 and look at verse 18 once more. We go to Jerusalem where he was betrayed. We go to Jerusalem where he was condemned. Look at it, verse 18. Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be betrayed unto the chief priests and unto the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death. Now, the condemnation here speaks of the judicial trial that the Sanhedrin, the highest Jewish council in Israel, would put him through. And it's worth being reminded that this was no fair trial, by the way. It's what we would call a kangaroo court. They already had their outcome that they wanted, and they weren't concerned to follow the Jewish traditions of the law to ensure that everything was carried out peacefully and justly. No, this man was to be condemned to death, and that's why they brought him before the trial that they did. Again, you're in chapter 20. We're going to go back to chapter 26, 27, and 28 frequently, so just flip back there again. Go to Matthew 26, and I want you to see how this unfolds just as Jesus predicted it. So he's saying we've got to go to Jerusalem because there I will be betrayed, and there I will be condemned. And here's how that condemnation looked. Matthew 26:59. Now the chief priests and elders and all the council, this is the Sanhedrin, 71 of them, they sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death. This is no fair trial. One agenda, put him to death. So let's do what we got to do, even false witnesses, to accomplish that. But what happened? Verse 60, they found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. In other words, none of their stories were good enough. And the last came two false witnesses and said, this fellow said, in other words, Jesus said this, he said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it again in 3 days. Of course, the high priest arose and said unto him, answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But Jesus held his peace, which was another fulfillment of the prediction of Isaiah chapter 53, that he would be brought before the slaughter, a lamb dumb. He would not open up his mouth. He would not say a word to defend himself. He held his peace. And the high priest answered, verse 63, and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said unto him, you have said it. Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. And that was just enough. That's all they needed. Because in verse 65 it says the high priest rent his clothes. It was a sign of sin in the presence. He stood up and he ripped off, he tore the robe off, saying, he has spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, you have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? And of course all of them answered and said, he is guilty of death. Jesus said to his disciples, we go to Jerusalem because there I will be betrayed. There I will be condemned to death. Write down number 3, we go to Jerusalem where he was delivered. Not delivered in the sense that he was freed from this unjustness. But no, where he was delivered from the Jewish hands to the Roman authorities. Look at it again in verse 19 back in Matthew 20. Here's what he says. We're going to go up to Jerusalem. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to be condemned to death. Verse 19, and I will be delivered to the Gentiles. I will be delivered to the Gentiles. Now, the reason the Jews had to deliver Jesus over the Gentiles, the Romans in this situation, was because Rome did not allow nations under their rule to impose the death penalty without their approval. We've been studying through these scriptures long enough to understand that Israel was not an independent nation, as it were. Roman authorities governed them. They ruled over them. And so they would allow the Jewish people to carry out sanctions of their own law as we know it in the Torah. But when it came to things like this, Roman authorities had to check off the box of approval before they allowed them to carry it out. And so here the Jewish Sanhedrin is saying he is guilty of blasphemy. Let's put him to death. But they couldn't do that on their own without Rome approving. And so here they come and they deliver him to the Gentiles, to the Romans, because they were required to do this in order to carry out their scheme. This is where the infamous figure Pilate comes into play. In fact, you're in chapter 20. Hold your finger there. Go to chapter 27. I told you we're going to go back and forth a lot, all right? Back and forth. This is good going back and forth, all right? It's not like all that Republican and Democratic stuff y'all been watching on TV. This is good going back and forth. All right, Matthew 27. Look at it, verse 11. And Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, Art thou the King of the Jews? And Jesus said unto him, Thou sayest. And when he was accused of the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then said Pilate unto him, Hearest thou not how many things they witness against thee? And he answered him never a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. Now at that feast, the governor was wont to release unto the people a prisoner whom they would. It was a part of their traditions. Every year, in Passover, they released a prisoner out of their goodwill. And verse 16 says they had a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, Whom will ye that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ? For he knew that for envy they had delivered him. In other words, Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent of these charges. The only reason they had brought Jesus to him was because they hated him and wanted to destroy him. So in order to connive his way out of it, he decides to go through this tradition, knowing that a man like Barabbas, they would not want released unto the streets again. So he thought he had played his cards well, and he puts both of them in the front, and he says what he says here. Who do you want, Barabbas or Jesus? Verse 19. And when he sat down on the judgment seat, his wife sent unto him, saying, Have thou nothing to do with that just man? For I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask for Barabbas' release and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said unto them, Whether of the two will ye that I release unto you? They said, Barabbas, give us Barabbas. Kill Jesus, give us Barabbas. Verse 22, Pilate said unto them, What shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ? And they all said unto him, Let him be crucified. And the governor said, Why? What evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, Let him be crucified. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, he did the political thing. He took water, washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. Go, essentially, and do what you wish. Then answered all the people and said, His blood be on us and on our children. We will visit a place this coming week. I think I have a picture here of it where this actually went down. This is the chambers when Pilate would come to Jerusalem, where he would stay during the feast of the Passover. And there's actually etched in stones here games that Roman soldiers would play when they would gamble for the attire and the robes of those whom they would crucify. It's on that very pavement that Pilate had this interaction with the chief priest. This is a part of the plan. Before it ever happened, Jesus said, look, listen to me. We are going to Jerusalem. And I've told you this many times, but I need to remind you, I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to be condemned to death. I will be delivered to the Romans. Number 4, we go to Jerusalem where he was mocked. We go to Jerusalem where he was mocked. Go back to chapter 20, verse 19. The Bible says they shall deliver him to the Gentiles to mock. Now the mocking had already started way before this moment. But the release of Barabbas and the agreement to crucify Jesus just intensified the people's desire to mock him. I want you to see this again. Hold your finger there. Go back to chapter 27. For the first time in a long time, some of you who use dual screens on your iPads for your Bibles, like, this has really paid off. Matthew 27, look at verse 27. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall, and they gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. They stripped him. They put on him a scarlet robe. And when they platted a crown of thorns on his head, they put it upon his head and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him. They're doing exactly what he said they would do. Mocking him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." The whole scene is blasphemous. Here's your king, Israel. Look at him. Look how powerful he is. Look how strong he is. They spit upon him, verse 30. They took the reed and they smote him on the head. And after they had mocked him, they took the robe off from him and put his own raiment on him and led him away to crucify him. Of course, the mockery continues even while he's on the cross. Skip down to verse 39 of Matthew 27. And they that passed by, this is him on his cross. They that passed by, they reviled him, wagging their heads, shaking their heads in disgrace. Verse 41. Likewise also the chief priest, mocking him with the scribes and the elders, said, "He saved others, himself he cannot save. If he be the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross. Then we will believe him." Proof that they did not understand why Messiah had truly come. Not to perform some miraculous saving of himself, but rather to carry out a miraculous saving of others. May we not look too deeply into these scenes and shake our heads in awe and not yet consider that every stripe, every spitting, every mockery, it was all in our place. The disciples didn't get it. They hadn't seen this far into the future, but Jesus is saying, looking, we're going to Jerusalem because it was there I was betrayed. It was there I was condemned. It's there I'm going to be delivered. It's there I'm going to be mocked. Number 5, we go to Jerusalem where he was scourged. We go to Jerusalem where he was scourged. Again, chapter 20, verse 19. I will be delivered to the Gentiles to mock. Here's the next one. And to scourge. Now quickly, the scourging was part of the crucifixion process. Leather whips with broken pieces of bone and metal and glass were tied to the end of each lash. And this is what they used to beat him. As they would take that whip with those broken pieces of bone, glass, and metal, and every time they would strike it across his back. And they would let the pieces dig into his flesh at just the right tension, pulling it back again to bring out a filleting, if you will, of the human body. Historians tell us that during Roman crucifixions that most would never even make it to the cross because of the infliction that would be brought into their body by means of scourging. This is what Isaiah prophesied when he said, by his stripes we will be healed. And now Jesus is looking for the third time in his journey with the disciples. He's saying, we're going to Jerusalem because there I will be beaten. There I will be scourged. My body and flesh will be ripped apart for the sin of the world. You don't have to turn back because we're going to go back there in a moment. Let me just read this one verse, Matthew 27:26. Then released he Barabbas unto them, and when he had scourged Jesus, they delivered him to be crucified. Which leads me to the sixth thing. Number 6, we go to Jerusalem where he was crucified. We go to Jerusalem where he was crucified. I have a picture of Golgotha to show you on the screen. For Jesus predicted here in his time with the disciples in Matthew 20:19, and shall deliver into the Gentiles to mock, to scourge, and to crucify him. We'll be able to see it when we go, and not so sure that it actually happened on top of Golgotha. You can see with the picture there why it would be identified as the place of the skull. Of course, deterioration through the years has diminished what that would have looked like many years ago. But you can see indented there where the two eyes would be and that nose area being pointed out. That's why they identified it as a place of the skull. On top of it now is a Muslim cemetery. At the bottom of it is a city bus parking lot. It's in that bus parking lot where most likely Jesus and the other two men were crucified, not actually on the hill or Golgotha, but with Golgotha in the background. For it was the practice of the Romans to put those who were crucified as close to the road as they possibly could, because they were trying to say something. They were sending a message to the rest of the people that don't you defy us. That don't you go against who we are, because this could be you. In fact, historians tell us that's exactly what the Roman soldiers would do, as they were not only tending to those who were being crucified, they would stand out there on the road and send that message to the passerbys as they walked by. Which is why we see the narrative in Scripture where Jesus could talk to John and his mother. This wasn't a grave distance. This was right in the main thoroughfare of the people. This is the place of the skull. This is Golgotha. And listen, Jesus' physical sufferings never need to be minimized. Crucifixion was excruciating, which is why the Romans preferred to do this in public fashion. The loss of blood, the exposure of organs, the struggle to breathe, it's all a part of Rome's desire to humiliate their enemies. And that little phrase, and they crucified him, though small in the English language, is the greatest and most impactful message that has ever been uttered. Let me read the account for you if you want to flip over there. Matthew 27, beginning at verse 32. And as they came out, Matthew 27:32, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name, and they compelled him to bear his cross. They forced him to do it. And when they were coming to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, a place of a skull, they gave him vinegar to drink mingled with gall. And when he had tasted thereof, he would not drink. And they crucified him. They parted his garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet. They parted my garments among them, and upon my vesture they did cast lots. And sitting down, they watched him there. And set up over his head this accusation written, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Now skip down to verse 45. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land of the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That is the moment by which Jesus bore all the sins of all the world. Some of them that stood there, when they heard that, said, this man calleth for Elijah. Straightway one of them ran and took a sponge, filled it with vinegar, and put it on a reed, and gave him to drink. The rest said, let be, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. But when Jesus had cried again with a loud voice, he yielded up the ghost. Of course, we recognize that Jesus' greatest sufferings that day were not physical and emotional, even though they were intense. His greatest were spiritual, as he bore in his body the sin of many. Jesus that day suffered the pain of disloyalty. He suffered the pain of rejection, the pain of humiliation, the pain of unjust guilt, the pain of injury, the pain of death itself. But this is exactly why he went to Jerusalem. He went to Jerusalem because he had foreordained it. He had orchestrated it. He had sovereignly directed every step of mankind to point to this moment in which he would be betrayed, in which he would be condemned to death, in which he would be mocked and scourged, crucified. But that is not the end of the story. Because just about 100 yards from that place is an empty tomb. Jesus said, we go to Jerusalem where he was raised again. Verse 19, again, back in Matthew 20, they will deliver him to the Gentiles to be mocked, to be scourged, to crucify him. And the third day he shall rise again. Death wasn't the end of the story. Had death been the end of the story, then according to Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, preaching would be profitless. Faith would be foolish. The disciples would be deceived. Sin would be sovereign. Death would have dominion. The future would be fearful. But Christ did not remain dead. He rose again. And because he rose again, our preaching is profitable. Our faith is feasible. Disciples are dependable. Sin is subdued. Death has been defeated. And thank God the future is fabulous because he has risen again. I have a picture of that empty tomb. But 25 of you will have to come see it for yourself. Trust me, there's no one in there. It was only occupied for 3 days. Not even enough time to mount any kind of dust. He who is dead now forever lives. But it's not so much the absence of a person inside that tomb that is the greatest message. It's the presence of a person inside my life that shows that he is exactly who he said he was. Let's go to one more passage. Flip over to Matthew chapter 28. This will be where we end. Matthew 28, verse 1. In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for the angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door, sat upon it. His countenance was like lightning, his raiment was white as snow. And for fear of him, the keepers did shake and became as dead men. And the angel answered and said unto the women, Fear not ye, for I know that ye seek Jesus, which was crucified, but he is not here. He is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where the Lord lay. And now go quickly, tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he goeth before you into Galilee. There shall ye see him. Lo, I have told you this. And they departed quickly from the sepulchre with fear and great joy, and did run to bring his disciples word. And as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, Stop. And they came and held him by the feet and worshiped him. And this is why you and I are even here today. Because of his death, his burial, but because of his resurrection. The disciples still didn't get it. Because in the very next series of verses, they're arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. I mean, nothing helps me resonate more as a parent than when I see Jesus' interactions with his disciples. Are you not listening to what I am saying to you? Apparently not. Because they're not thinking again about suffering. They're thinking about the kingdom. They're not thinking about him as a sacrificed lamb. They're thinking about him as a ruling lion. But Jesus came here the first time not to establish his kingdom then. He came to be a propitiation for our sins. And for that, unto him be glory in the church throughout all ages, world without end. You see, you may not be going to Jerusalem with us tomorrow. That's okay. One day you'll go, whether it's in this life or the next. What's most important is, do you believe the message of Jesus? I hope you do. If not, let us help you. I'd love to take a few moments to share with you about the truth and love of Jesus before you leave tonight.